women were making green dolls out of corn sheaves, and old men were mending blankets. The little girls were embroidering blood-red flowers on white dresses, and the little boys were out in the fields pitching great piles of golden hay. The women were sewing scratchy shirts for the winter, and the men were out in the fields toiling, trying to harvest last year's labors. And the wind was blowing stronger and stronger, loosening the leaves little by little. And somewhere down by the river, Mother Duck sat brooding over her nest of eggs. Now everything was going just fine for this Mother Duck. As one by one her little eggs began to tremble and shake, and one by one each little duckling staggered out of its shell, all save for one, the big one that sat there like a stone. And it just so happened that another mother duck was waddling by, showing off her brood, when out of the corner of her eye she saw that egg sitting there, and she said, "What's wrong with that one? That's not a proper egg at all. Why, that's a turkey egg. You shouldn't sit on that one even a minute longer. Turkeys don't swim, you know. They'll just die anyway." But the mother duck had been sitting for so long, she thought it wouldn't hurt to sit just a little longer. And so she kind of waved her off, and she said, "Oh, I don't care about that. But do you know that that father of mine hasn't come see me since those ducklings have been born?" Well, it just so happened that the next day, that big egg began to tremble, shake, and roll, and each little fissure gave way to a crack, and out of that crack emerged a most ungainly creature. He had clear skin with curly red and blue lines all over it. He had translucent pink eyes and enormous pale purple feet. And the mother duckling looked this way and that way and up and down and couldn't help but declare it ugly. Maybe it isn't mine, she thought. But the next day, when the rest of her brood went out to swim, there went the ugly duckling right alongside. He went right in the water and swam straight and true as the rest. And so she stayed on the shore and she watched him through the reeds. And she thought, you know what? In a certain light, he may even be handsome. So the next day, she brought her brood down to the farmyard to show them off, and she was walking around, and all of a sudden, across the yard shoots this duck that bites him cruelly in the neck and draws blood. And she puffs up and she says, "Stop it! Stop right now!" And another duck comes out and begins pecking at the little poor ugly duckling. And she stood up and said, "Stop again! Stop! Stop!" And he said, "He's so ugly, he deserves to be put in his place." Well, all this ruckus got the attention of the old hen, and she came out with her red rag around her ankle, and she said, "Oh, that must be a mistake. Like we don't have enough mouths to feed." But the mother duckling said, "Oh, no, you're mistaken. He just stayed in the shell a little bit too long. You wait, he's going to be just fine. He'll be just fine." And this is how her days were spent, was trying to protect this ugly duckling from all this jeering. But she couldn't be at all places at once, and when he was on the pond, he would zig this way and zag that way, trying to avoid all the blows. They would peck at him until almost all his feathers were gone, and he was bleeding. And so he took to staying in the reeds and doing what he did best, which was to make himself as small as possible. Try not to be noticed. But one day, the teasing got so bad, the ugly duckling felt as bereft as ever, and he came bedraggled home with what was left of his feathers and looked up at his mom. And his mom shook her head, exhausted, and said, "I wish you were never born." And my life would be so much easier if you would just go away. So that night, the ugly duckling picked himself up in what was left of his feathers, and on his pale purple feet, he walked out into the wide world. And he walked for as far as his purple feet would take him, until he ended up by a marsh. And these two mallard ducks came skidding down right near him, and they looked at him and they said, "You're a mess. Too bad, so sad." And then they started flying away. But the shots rang out through the air and filled with sound, and pretty soon the marsh was running red with the blood of those mallards. And so the ugly duckling did what he could, what he did best, and he ran behind into the reeds, and he made himself as small as possible, while his heart was just beating in his chest, trembling, as the hunters came and retrieved their kill, and the smoke finally dissipated from the air. And again, the little ugly duckling picked himself up on his pale purple feet and walked on into the night until he came to a hovel on the side of the hill. And the people who lived inside were so poor that the door hung by one string. And there were huge gaps, almost more gaps than boards. And inside lived a raggedy old woman, an uncombed cat, and a cross-eyed hen. The uncombed cat earned his keep by catching mice, and the cross-eyed hen earned her keep by laying eggs. So the raggedy old woman thought, aha, if I take this little duckling in, maybe it'll lay eggs for me. And if it doesn't, I'll eat it for my supper. So she took the little ugly duckling in, but the teasing began almost immediately. But this time there was a cat involved, and he was scratched, and he was clawed, and he was pecked, until after a couple of weeks when it became obvious that he was not going to be laying any eggs for anybody under any circumstances. The uncombed cat said to him, "What value do you have? What good are you? You can't catch mice and you can't lay eggs. What are you good for?" And the ugly duckling felt more bereft than ever before and collapsed down on himself in shame. And the cross-eyed hen said, "Well, what do you like? What do you like?" He kind of thought about it, and he said, "I like being under. I like being under the emerald water. And I like being under the crystalline blue sky. I love that." And they laughed at him, and they began peering anew, and they were relentless again in their teasing and their picking, until finally, in the night, he escaped through one of the cracks in the board and went out again into the wide world on his little purple feet. Well, he spent some time swimming around in a pond when he heard overhead a cry. And this cry hit something deep in his soul and resonated with him. And he looked up and he saw in the sky the most beautiful creatures he had ever seen in his life. And something in his heart called to go with him, and yet something in his heart broke in two at the same time. And a yearning, a secret yearning began to burn in his heart as he yearned more and more for those beautiful creatures who had passed above. But alas, he picked up his little wings, and they wouldn't fly. There weren't enough feathers. And so in the pond he stayed. Well, the wind blew the cold and the frost in, and the snow. And the old men were busy chipping ice off the top of the milk pails. The old women were spinning long into the night. The women were feeding hungry mouths, and the men were out in the field under starry skies searching for sheep who had been lost. The little boys trudged in waist-deep snow out to the barn to get milk for their families. And the little girls sat by the fire, looking into the flames, hoping to see the faces of their beloved. And somewhere down by the pond, that poor ugly duckling swam round and round in circles, faster and faster, trying to keep a space in the ice for himself as it was freezing over. Until one day he woke and his legs were completely encased in ice. And just then 2 mallard ducks skidded down next to him, And he thought, oh, maybe they'll help me. But they looked at him and they said, oh, you're a mess. Too bad, so sad. And off they flew. And thinking that was his last chance, the ugly duckling put his head down on the ice and felt the cool of the ice on his face. And there was something about the coolness that was like numbness that spread through his body that felt far preferable to him than the pain he had been feeling. And he waited there for death to come up and gather his last breath away. Well, as luck would have it, a farmer had been passing by, picked up a staff, and began chipping at the ice around the ugly duckling, scooped him up, put him under his arm, and off he went to his own house, where he was going to give him as a gift to some of his children. But as soon as they got in the house, the children were squealing and running, and the ugly duckling was so very terrified that he began flapping his wings, which made the dust fall into the butter. And that angered the farmer's wife, who picked up a broom and began chasing him, and so he went into the butter vat. She chased him out into the milk pail, chased him out into the flour bin, chased him out the dog door, and there he was, covered in flour and butter and water, walking out into the wide world again on his pale purple feet. He spent most of the winter like this, alternating between house and pond and house and pond, teetering vicariously on the edge of life and death. But as fate would have it, the warm breath of spring came, and the old women came out and began shaking out their feather beds. The old men took off their long underwear. The women gave birth to babies in the night, while the men paced outside under starry skies, waiting for such babies to be born. The little girls wore daffodils in their hair, and the little boys stared at the little girls' ankles. And somewhere, down by a pond, the ugly duckling stretched out his wings for the first time in the spring. And he noticed how big and strong they were. And he began flapping them, feeling out their power. And all of a sudden, those wings lifted him right up out of the pond. And he flew over all the hedgerows and the fields and the orchards and the houses and the ponds, having never known such incredible joy. And while he was in this joyous feeling, he looked down and he spotted those beautiful creatures he had seen fall before. And so carefully he skidded to a stop at the other end of the pond, and he waited and sat there and watched them. And when they saw him, they began moving towards him. And of course, his little heart began to beat. And he thought, oh no, 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 not again. For these creatures will surely peck me to death. And so as they approached, the duckling lowered his head, waiting for the blows. And he waited. And when no blows came, he opened his eyes. And he saw before him his own reflection. And what he saw was a beautiful swan, complete with snowy plumage and slow eyes. He was a swan. There had been a mistake. His egg had rolled into the wrong nest. And those to whom he belonged to came around him, stretched out their wings, and touched him gently and lovingly with the tips of their wings, groomed him with their beaks, circling round and round in greeting and in acceptance. And the little children who came to feed the swan's bread said, oh look, there's a new one, there's a new one. And like children everywhere, they ran to tell everybody. And so the old women came down and unbraided their long gray plaits of hair. The old men came down and sat and talked about how long war was and how short life was. The women took a break from their mending. The men took a break from their milking just to come down and be with one another. And the little boys picked up emerald pools of green water and splashed the little girls, whose cheeks turned red as rose petals. But because of time, because of seasons changing, they all danced away. The old men and women, they danced away. The husbands and wives danced away. Even the ugly duckling, the swans, and the children danced away, leaving nothing but us and the springtime and another mother duck down by the riverside, brooding over her nest eggs. That's the ugly duckling. Okay, so I want you to look at these questions. I want you to turn to the same people you were just talking to before. You don't have to answer all of them.